On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The motion is not agreed to.
Republicans block a voting rights bill in the U.S. Senate. Plus, bipartisan negotiations continue on infrastructure, but can they reach a deal? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to meet with lawmakers this week as a group of Democrats and Republicans try to reach agreement on an infrastructure plan that could actually make it through Congress with bipartisan support. We'll have more on that later on in the program, but we begin with the latest on voting rights. The Democrat-controlled Senate held a procedural vote on Tuesday on an amended version of the For the People Act, but it failed to get enough Republicans to join with Democrats and clear the required 60-vote hurdle to move forward. For more, we turn to CGTN's Nathan King. And Nathan, this wasn't a vote on the content of the bill per se. Explain that to us. And according to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the legislation is an effort to respond to new restrictive voting laws in Republican-led states.
Yeah, I mean, the Senate is a minefield of convention and contradiction, isn't it? But essentially, this was a vote on whether to have a debate or not. And something called the filibuster, which most of our international audience now knows, is that you basically need 60 votes to move forward with anything in the U.S. Senate, so long as it's not a financial bill. And this voting rights bill was a centerpiece of the Biden administration, also before the Biden administration, for Democrats who basically saw what happened on January 6th and the lead up to the general election, but also afterwards in terms where the lie of essentially saying that there was voter fraud and people turning out who shouldn't have voted, etc., by former U.S. President Donald Trump was perpetuated. And we saw that insurrectional stroke coup attempt here on Capitol Hill. But the Republicans very much framing this in versus a federal takeover of the voting system, even when it comes to federal elections, because let's face it, the states do organize their own elections. Let's listen to Roy Blunt, the senator for the state of Missouri.
It's frankly a politically motivated federal takeover of the election systems that would make, in my opinion, elections more chaotic, less secure, less nimble in their ability to deal with individual circumstances that occur on election day. The strength of the election system, Mr. President, is the diversity of the election system. This is what President Obama thought in 2016. He may not still believe that, but I still believe it.
Well, more chaotic than we saw from November to January this year? Well, maybe not, Mr. Blunt, but you see the point here. And, you know, for our international audience, the word states' rights has a long history in the U.S. It usually is a dog whistle, a code word for disenfranchising African Americans and other groups. And let's face it, you know, this whole pandemic and the expansion of ways to vote spooked Republicans, voting by mail, being able to register. What this bill would have done was basically create federal holidays for voting when it comes to federal elections. It would have stopped this gerrymandering, or at least monitored it more closely, where political parties can change the borders of districts to encompass more of their traditional voters. This goes on all the time. And it was a real key piece of legislation for the Democrats. So the question is, what do they do now? There's even talk of changing the filibuster from progressives. Let's listen to Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats, the majority leader by a slim margin, as we found out today. Chuck Schumer.
Right now, it is a fact, that voting rights are under assault in America in a way that we have not seen in many, many decades. Are we going to backslide here in the 21st century? Are we going to let reactionary state legislatures drag us back into the muck of voter suppression? Are we going to let the most dishonest president in history continue to poison our democracy from the inside? Or will we stand up to defend what generations of Americans have organized, marched, fought, and died for, the sacred, sacred right to vote?
It's interesting that Chuck Schumer said that March. The bill that currently is presented and amended in the Senate was actually named after John Lewis, the civil rights leader, veteran civil rights leader, who passed away in the last 12 months. There's a wonderful graphic novel series about his life called March, and I encourage everyone to read it, Mike.
Well, Nathan, there is a bipartisan group in the Senate actually working on a reported $1.2 trillion infrastructure plan. What can you tell us about that? Is there one area where they actually can't agree?
There is an agreement, which is essentially the Republicans are happy for a smaller bill, as long as it doesn't have any sort of green initiatives in it, and also doesn't encompass the American Families Plan, which essentially would create human infrastructure, which is the support that it would provide for home help, for pre-K, we're talking about education and other things. It may be that there is some sort of agreement on this, so long as progressives in the party of the Democrats get another bill when it comes to green initiatives and others, that they can pass through something called reconciliation, which means it's a financial bill, doesn't have to have the filibuster, isn't threatened by the filibuster by 60 votes. This is really complicated. We keep on coming up with this. What today really showed is that when it comes to democracy in this country, when it comes to moving anyone forward, even if the Democrats hold the White House just down the street here, the Senate and the House, any party can block it because of the Senate 60 vote rule. Now, many senators want to change it. A few who basically would lose out by changing it don't. The question is, where does American democracy go from now? And I can tell you, the world is watching too, right?
It's an important question, and the answer is still very much up in the air. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us there from Capitol Hill. Again, CGTN's Nathan King reporting for us. Well, there's a lot to cover and talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Aaron Mate is host of Pushback with Aaron Mate on the Grayzone, an independent news site. Also with us, Leonard Steinhorn. He's a political analyst and professor of communication and history at American University. And Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist, and that's who we'll begin with. Republican senators sticking together on this. Mitch McConnell and his cohort saying, we're not going to debate this, we're not going to vote for it. Lockstep in line, 50-50 vote here. They don't even want a debate or a discussion of this bill. And it's interesting because Missouri Senator Roy Blunt invoking the name of Barack Obama, he was pretty outspoken about this. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Think about this. In the aftermath of an insurrection, with our democracy on the line, and many of these same Republican senators going along with the notion that somehow there were irregularities and problems with legitimacy in our most recent election, they're suddenly afraid to even talk about these issues and figure out solutions on the floor of the Senate. They don't even want to talk about voting. And that's not acceptable.
So, Adolfo, I want to get your response to what he had to say.
Well, let me just say a couple things. First of all, with all due respect, your reporter is quite an advocate for the left. I don't think there was any coup on January 6th, and certainly the Constitution of the United States leaves the elections rules to the states. So this is a constitutional question. I don't think it's a dog whistle for anything. And certainly that's the party line that your reporter was following for the Democrat Party, as of course as was President Obama. The answer to this is our rules. When the Democrats were around for the last 2 or 3 years in the minority, in the Trump administration, they invoked the filibuster 400 times. I didn't see people saying it was a dog whistle or a problem or anything of that kind. In fact, Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, resisted President Trump's repeated frustration about the filibuster and said those were the Senate rules. So it's not that we don't want to debate. We can debate anything. This is a procedural vote. What you do if you vote yes to this, if you have over 60 votes, that means that the votes then become just a majority, and that is not what the filibuster intends. So it's not that we don't want to debate. This is the way to invoke the filibuster in essence. The fact of the matter is, you have in this 50 vote Republican vote, you really have 51 because you really have Manchin. He was the Democrat senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, undecided until the very last minute, but he's decidedly against the bill. He just decided to vote with his party just so not to give the Republicans a talking point to say it was bipartisan opposition to proceed. The bottom line, though, on this is you have Republicans like Mitt Romney, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Minnesota, retiring senators who voted to impeach President Trump and have been lauded by the liberals against this bill because it's a federal grab and a Democrat grab to take over elections and, frankly, institutionalize things we've never had in this country, paying for finances of the elections by the federal government, voter ID, which is 71% of the American people oppose, harvesting of ballots. This is nothing to do. If you want integrity in elections, you have fair elections. Ensure that voters have a right to vote. And you don't loosen the requirements.
One quick clarification for you.
Election monitoring worldwide. You have people have fingerprints.
Okay. So they have this thing called the filibuster in Congress, and it seems as though you're kind of advocating it on this show. We do have to bring in the rest of our guests as well. And by the way, Lisa Murkowski is from the state of Alaska. Aaron, he said no coup attempt, and we're also hearing Paul Gosar, a member of the House, saying these were peaceful patriots. It was an attempted insurrection. What's your take on Adolfo's point on this?
You know what? I want to be fair. I personally don't use the term insurrection. To be honest about the facts, it was basically a bunch of hooligans storming the Capitol for a few hours. But, you know, they were unarmed and they were defeated pretty quickly once enough police got there. I think the main problem was the lack of proper planning beforehand. So I think what Trump did was reckless and insane. He should be held accountable for it. But the idea of this being a coup, I mean, a real coup involves the military force. This was a bunch of hooligans, and adequate security beforehand could have prevented that. So I want to be fair. When it comes to defending this new assault on voting rights, I completely reject that. I don't see how anybody can oppose simply trying to go back to the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. The For the People Act just calls for simple things like automatic registration beforehand on election day, 2 weeks of early voting, helping felons get the vote so that they're not disenfranchised. I don't understand why you could be opposed to that unless you want to deny a specific category of people the right to vote. And that has been the theme of Republicans on Democrats for many, many years now. You know, it's funny, we're talking about Georgia. In Georgia in 2005, you had state Republicans actually exempting mail-in ballots from their restrictions on voting. Fast forward to 2020, and all of a sudden you had African Americans voting in higher numbers through mail-in ballots, and white and rural voters voting less for mail-in ballots. Now all of a sudden Republicans are on board with restricting mail-in ballots. So the partisan interest is very clear here, and they're targeting people, the disenfranchised, African Americans especially, because of that. So I don't understand how if you support democracy, why you could oppose these voting rights measures in Congress.
Lenny, you have 14 states that have enacted new laws this year, which are tightening the rules about voting. How is this going to impact African American voters, other minorities in the midterm elections, do you think?
Well, I think it may impact them a great deal. If you restrict access or if you create hurdles to vote, that creates a problem. And let's be clear, let's be honest. The people in those states who are putting those laws together are not doing it in some sort of naive way that sort of is designed to touch every single voter. They are very clear in terms of the types of hurdles they are putting in place to be able to sort of limit the voting by people who oppose them, predominantly Democrats and minority Democrats. In Georgia, please explain to me the sort of rule that you don't allow people to sort of bring water and food to their while they're standing on line to vote. And where are these long lines to vote? They're typically in minority areas because you don't have as many voting booths in minority areas as you do in more rural areas. So that you could say across the board you can't do that on all precincts, but this is really targeted at a particular group. But there's a larger philosophical issue here, which is democracy should be all about the right of people, of voters to choose their leaders. But what we're seeing with a lot of these state bills is politicians choosing their voters. It happens either through gerrymandering or it happens either through restricting or limiting or creating hurdles to the right to vote. And if politicians begin to choose their voters, that upends what our democracy is all about. Keep this in mind. less than 45,000 votes was the difference between Donald Trump losing the Electoral College and having an Electoral College tie in which he likely would have won the presidency. If you limit people's ability to vote or create hurdles, those 45,000 votes could evaporate very easily in those states which are being targeted by the Republicans, and you have a change of administration. So this stuff has a serious impact.
Adolfo, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, yes. First of all, we had a record election this year. No one's impeding voting from anyone. A couple of things that are, talk about dog whistles and things of that kind. No one's against food or water. It's from partisan organizations. Nonpartisan organizations are exempt. You don't want people from one party and giving a favor to somebody on the line. These are just silly things that the Democrats are raising for the larger issues, which are voter IDs. We want a democracy to work. We want votes to be counted, fair votes. We want the situation that there is voter integrity. But we want a situation where you don't question the results of the election because you have a system in place. The reformed, or the bill in Georgia, the Georgia law, is more liberal than the Delaware law, where President Biden resigns. The laws in these states have never had anything to do with the Civil Rights Act or anything of that kind. This is now federalizing the election and taking it away from the people that our Constitution prohibits. 21 attorney generals have already filed suit and said they will file suit against this as unconstitutional. And that is the basis of this. This is the Democratic Party trying to put in a laundry list of wishes, ballot harvesting. That's democratic. Where you lose custody of the ballots, no signature verification. They want to eliminate standards. What problem happened in the last election that people were impeded from voting? Not true. We had record votes.
But you can't use the last election where voting did expand and to say that's great, and then all of a sudden go along with all of the Republican bills that want to undo some of the changes that expanded voting in this last election. So you can't have it both ways.
For voting by mail.
Excuse me, I'm talking.
Yeah. Let Lenny jump in here for just a minute.
I mean, look, if you want to spout Republican talking points, that's fine. But you can't let me finish.
Well, you're spouting Democrat talking points.
No, I'm not.
Yeah,
you go look at the Georgia bill and you tell me where it says that only partisan groups are not allowed to provide
you haven't
drinks
read
and
the law
refreshments.
with all due respect. It's an exemption for any organization that is not partisan. What we don't want is Democrat or Republican Party operatives offering food or water. Nobody's denying anything to anybody other than restrictions which exist right now in almost every state, how proximate you can hand out leaflets, food, any gratuity of any kind. I think those are voter integrity measures.
Look,
you are missing
the Bush
the
administration.
You're missing the voter ID requirements. You're overlooking the key provisions of this legislation that will create and perpetuate.
Adolfo, let me just let Lenny finish here. And Lenny, let me ask you, let me just frame it with a question, if I may, Lenny. Joe Manchin's come up with this proposal where he's kind of thrown in some things Republicans like as well as Democrats. Is there anywhere where you can see there can be some kind of agreement between these individuals where they may actually pass something?
Well, Joe Manchin has actually put in place something that a lot of Democrats don't like, which is to allow voter ID. But keep this in mind, in some states, the only voter ID that's allowed is photo ID. And in some states, they will allow, let's say, gun permits with a photo ID, but not university ID cards, because people with guns will tend to vote Republican. People with university ID cards may vote more Democratic. So there are particular aspects put into these laws that are designed to be partisan, even though they may appear nonpartisan. But the bottom line is this: there has been no evidence of voter fraud. This is a made-up issue. The Bush administration did a whole study on voter fraud. They came up with virtually next to no cases of that. The Trump administration had a commission on voter fraud, and that disbanded without any findings or anything. Yet, because the election turned out the way it did, all of a sudden people are talking about voter fraud and creating a fix to a problem that doesn't exist. And that's the problem.
Then
Okay,
why is it
I'm sorry, Adolfo, I'm sorry. We have to move on because we want to talk a little bit about infrastructure as well. And Aaron, we have a group of 21 senators, Republicans and Democrats, who are actually trying to move forward a piece of legislation talking about $1 trillion on transportation, broadband, and water systems. Over the weekend, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a member of this group, challenged the president to accept the compromise. Let's watch what he had to say.
I think the difference between this negotiation and the earlier negotiation is that we're willing to add more new money to infrastructure in this package, and I am hopeful if the White House and Joe Biden stay involved, we can get there. I would just say this, President Biden, if you want an infrastructure deal of $1 trillion, it's there for the taking. You just need to get involved and lead.
Aaron, what do you make of his comments?
Well, first of all, I have a major problem with this proposal, which is that it would preserve the tax heist, the Trump tax heist. One of Trump's few achievements was passing one of the largest upward transfers of wealth in U.S. history by cutting taxes to the ultra wealthy and corporations. And this bipartisan proposal would preserve that. If I were a Democrat, I think that would be a non-starter. You can't fund the programs that you want to fund in this country, and which are vitally needed, the bare minimum, really, to recover this country after COVID, by preserving the largest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history that, you know, gives a lot of money, gives even more money to the ultra wealthy. It's just a non-starter. So I think it's important that there's some effort at bipartisanship, but I think preserving one of Trump's worst policies is not the place to start.
Lenny, I want to ask you about two senators that President Biden is going to be meeting with. Joe Manchin, we've already mentioned him. He's from West Virginia. That's a reliably red state. It voted for Donald Trump. He barely eked out a win last time around. And Kirsten Sinema, who's from Arizona, who also won by a very narrow margin in Arizona. And these two senators have been kind of a sticking point for progressives in the Democratic Party. Talk to us about them and where we go with infrastructure. Do you think that there can be a deal made?
Well, again, the devil is in the details. So they can put together the outline of a deal, but the question is, will they be able to put enough details in there to satisfy enough people to get enough Republican and Democratic votes to be able to pass this? So what Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema are trying to do is sort of thread the needle, put in place a bill that's much less than Joe Biden's initial request, that doesn't include some of Joe Biden's sort of key programs, but much more than what the Republicans counter-offered with. So whether that's going to be sufficient, I don't know. But the bigger issue here is details. How do you pay for this bill? Joe Biden has said he wants to increase taxes on the wealthy or reverse the Trump taxes, as your previous speaker said. He says he wants to increase or reverse some of the reduction in corporate income taxes from the Trump tax bill of 2017. That seems to be a non-starter with the Republicans. So the big question then becomes, if this compromise bill can't pass because they can't ultimately agree on the details, which are always the important parts of these things, will the Democrats then move ahead through budget reconciliation to be able to sort of come up with a larger bill that will satisfy Sinema and Manchin and enable them to walk away saying, yeah, I see that bipartisan compromise didn't work, but I was able to bargain with the Democratic Party, bring the numbers down, and to be able to serve the people of our states. So I think that's really where it stands right now. Will the details work out? If not, will reconciliation work out?
Adolfo, Republicans were talking about infrastructure when Donald Trump was running for president. There's been a lot of Republicans who say they want it. What's it going to take to get a deal?
Well, and for 4 years, the president wanted infrastructure, but unlike the Republicans that are now willing to work with Democrats in the Senate, no Democrats are willing to work with the Trump administration. That's the difference. The Republicans, this group of 21, is really split half and half, Republicans and Democrats. So in good faith, Republicans want a deal. I wish we could have had it several years ago. There are a couple of things. I agree with many of the things, not all of the things your guests have said. Number one, Republicans want an infrastructure bill, which means infrastructure, not child care, not a laundry list of $4 trillion worth of unrelated infrastructures as most Americans understand it. So that's one of the issues, and that's what the group of 21 and its growing support for this, to talk about infrastructure.
Right. Right.
what we know it to be. That's number one. The secondly is the paying for it. The gas tax is something that was talked about. The Biden administration has put that aside. I think there is a strong possibility that there will be a bipartisan deal. It probably will be over $1 trillion. I don't think the Trump tax cut across the board for every American is going to be repealed. I just don't believe that's the case. But they're going to have to find a way to pay for this, even if it's only $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion. I'm saying only.
Yeah.
The trick on this deal, though, is going to be something that appeases both sides, because I'm not sanguine that Senator Manchin can sign on to a Democrat-only reconciliation measure that attacks coal in his state. I just don't believe it. So I think without Republicans, they're using them as a foil, as a way to say we got to get them on board to be able to have a deal at all. I'm not sure that Democrats have 50 votes.
All right. Well, we're running out of time here. I do want to ask Aaron a question about vaccines. President Biden had this goal of 70% of adults being vaccinated by July 4th. He looks as though he's going to fall short of that. About 64% of adults have received at least one dose. According to the Washington Post, it looks like maybe the projection will be in August this will happen. But what do you make of the delay in the vaccine and still this hesitancy? We're hearing, I think, about a third of the Americans really have no plans to actually get the vaccine anytime soon. What do you make of that, Aaron?
The U.S. is an increasingly paranoid society, which I just think reflects the general state of poor socioeconomic conditions here, a bad economy, people struggling with the basics. The government doesn't provide people with health care. It leads to an overall climate of suspicion of the government and unease. But in the case of the vaccine specifically, I think this is an area where, you know what, people like Dr. Fauci should take some responsibility. They should apologize to the American public for saying early on that they didn't need masks, and then later on admitting that they were lying. I mean, that helps create distrust. It's not the sole reason, the only factor that leads to this hesitancy to get vaccinated, but it's a factor because people need to trust in their public health leaders. And someone like Dr. Fauci has been inconsistent. In the case of the masks, he told a falsehood. He misled people.
Right.
Maybe he had a good reason for it, but I think that taking some responsibility might help deal with some of the anxiety that is out there about vaccines. Now, to be fair to the government, some things are beyond the government's control. People are just generally skeptical. But I do think the government should take some minimal responsibility for the misleading claims.
I have to jump in just briefly. Lenny, we've got about 45 seconds left. What does this mean for the president and his party leading into the midterms if we still have this pandemic running through the country?
Well, look, it's a problem, but we are returning to normal life in most parts of the country, notwithstanding some of the variants that are popping up, particularly in states where people are either refusing to or not getting vaccinated. You're seeing that in certain southern states with low vaccination numbers. So it's a problem if this thing does spread, but you have to feel good about a country that did do a mass vaccination and is trying to return to normal, get people back in school, get people back to work, get people back to normal lives. And if Joe Biden can talk about that as an accomplishment, I think that will be very helpful for him in 2022. But again, you hear all sorts of misinformation and disinformation and people blaming Democrats and Republicans and Anthony Fauci. That stuff isn't going to help.
Yeah, well, we've run out of time. I want to thank all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.